following is from the summing up from the trial of Michael Steele and Jack Williams from Tuesday, the 6th of January, 1998. Kenneth Jiggins has been a close friend of the farmer who farms White House Farm, Peter Theobald, for 25 years. He helps in the pheasant shoot and the duck shoot. Workhouse Lane at the time had a single metal gate across the track which leads to the fields, the pond, the wood and further onto the farm. The gate was normally locked in the shooting season, which this was from mid-July to the end of February, in order to deter poachers. On the 6th of December 1995, Mr. Jiggins went about 4 o'clock in the afternoon to feed the pheasants and the ducks, but he only fed the ducks. It was too late for the pheasants. He drove back through the gateway and locked the gate at around about 5 o'clock. He thought the snow had just stopped and there was no other vehicle on the route. Next morning, 7th of December, at 7:45, he went to the yard, met Peter Theobald, and him and Peter Theobald drove in the Land Rover down the track. There was a lot of snow and ice over the puddles as they drove, and none of the ice had been broken. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning that they came across the blue Range Rover parked facing the gate. They stopped 20 yards short of it. Mr. Jiggins went to the driver's side to ask whoever it was inside to move so they can get through into the field. He tapped on the driver's window but did not look through at the window. It was because he got no response that he did then look down through the window and saw what must have been the dreadful sight of the driver's head lying to one side of the window with blood coming from his nose and mouth. The front passenger's head was slumped forward and there was lots of blood to his head and chest. It was only the two bodies in the front that Mr. Jiggins noticed, and he called to Peter Theobald, telling him what he had seen, only mentioning the two people. Peter Theobald came down to the Range Rover, and as Mr. Jiggins was making a 999 call, Peter Theobald said, "There's another one in the back as well." They got into the Land Rover, turned around, went back to the A130 to await the police who had been called on the telephone. The police came after about 5 minutes and left their vehicle at the side of the track. All four, the two police officers and the two farmers, walked back towards the top of the lane. But the two civilians did not go as far as the police officers and waited further down the track. Cross-examined by Mr. Parkins, Mr. Jiggins said that the A130 was a very busy road mornings and in the evenings, 7 till 9 in the morning, and from about 4:35 to about 6:30ish. He also said that courting couples used the track as a lover's lane. There was a padlock on the gate for 6 to 9 months, replacing one that was lost, and there was a fishing syndicate of about 10 to 15 people who would have several keys. There was a way to the gate from the other side, but you had to go across fields. He looked at the photographs and said the tyre marks looked fresh. That is the ones on the other side of the fence, but the ruts were deeper, and this is why they looked undisturbed. The first dark stretch was a deeper track. He looked at Exhibit 3, the map, and said Retterdon Hall was on a higher ground and had a view down into the Workhouse Lane. The lane was fairly low down, and the land rose up to Meadow Road. He did not see signs of a well-defined shoe print. He did not walk around the Land Rover. His own Wellingtons were 9 in size, and they were taken from him by the police. He did not look for cartridge cases. Cross-examined by Mr. Lederman, he said there was some snow on the morning of the 7th of December. In certain parts, there was fluffy snow and ice. In other parts that were sheltered, there was very little snow. Mr. Theobald gave you similar evidence about the gate always being locked. He told you about going down on the morning of the 7th of December with Mr. Jiggins and getting to the Range Rover parked in front of the gate, and about Mr. Jiggins going to the driver's window, tapping on it, getting no response, calling to him, and he spoke of seeing the third body himself. He talked of the mobile phone being used, and of them having to drive back to the A130, then going off to feed the birds but not using that track. In cross-examination, he said all the shooting syndicate had keys, so there was about 10 or a dozen keys to the gate. They had retreated from the Range Rover so not to interfere with any marks. His own Wellington boots were taken. Their vehicle had not been down the track after 7 o'clock on the previous evening. The next morning, they had to defrost it. There was no snow or frost anywhere on the roof or the windscreen of the Range Rover. No steaming up of the interior. He would have expected to be frosted up if it had been there for many hours. In cross-examination by Mr. Lederman, he said there was enough frost to need to defrost his own vehicle. His own vehicle had been parked since 5 p.m. the previous night on the farmyard, which is fairly open to the weather. Barry Knights, a police constable, and a Sergeant Christopher Atkins were the first two police officers who arrived in the police car at 8:17 on the Thursday morning, and they were there for about 5 hours. They saw and spoke to both the farmers, Mr. Fearbold and Mr. Jiggins, and then walked down the track, which was a single vehicle route and had about 2.5 centimetres, about an inch of snow on it. They saw what was obviously Mr. Jiggins' vehicle had made 2 tyre tracks down the track. As they rounded the right-hand bend, Mr. Knights immediately saw the Range Rover and later the registration F424NPE. He asked Mr. Jiggins and Fearbold to stop where they were about 25 yards from the vehicle. The Range Rover was quite dirty and the only area he could see was through the rear windscreen wash and wipe. The gate was about 5 yards in front of the vehicle. He saw the 2 bodies in the front seats and walked to the offside of the vehicle and saw 3 blue shotgun cartridges lying in the snow beside the driver's door. The driver was sitting in a normal position with his head leaning on his left shoulder. The front passenger had his chin on his chest. There was also a third person sitting in the back, sitting slightly slumped, leaning forwards against the nearby passenger window with his head against the window, which was actually smashed. Mr. Knights walked around the rear of the vehicle and stood at the rear near side corner and saw another blue shotgun cartridge on the ground outside the rear passenger door. He could see the large wound clearly visible in the rear passenger's head, which was leaning against the broken window. After a brief conversation with Sergeant Atkins, it was Mr. Knights that was left there by the scene. Sergeant Atkins went to call for assistance from other police and he stayed in a small turning off the track. It was his job to protect the scene. He looked for a pattern of anyone walking down the lane, but there was no signs except for the vehicle going down. There were points to indicate people had been up to the scene. Atkins and he had been very careful not to disturb anything and not to let things be trodden on. He tried not to tread on the footprints. His own boots were taken for testing, and he would have expected any footwear of anyone who went near the vehicle to be taken to be tested. He was the first person there, apart from the farmers. He could not define what footprints there were, but they were in different directions around the vehicle. He could not define who made them. To the rear of the vehicle and on the offside, there were 2 marks he saw himself. He did not touch any cartridge cases. He only noticed the 3 on the offside and the 1 on the near side. He got bomb tape from the vehicle and put it down to make a track on one side. Nobody wandered down the track. He was in the turning area and he could not see anyone where he was. He said he definitely would not have put his police boot near any cartridge that you can see in the photos. In re-examination, he told that as the snow was melting, he informed the other officers further away what was happening. They were at the A130 end of the track. From his position, nobody could have come past without him seeing it. Nobody did, not a member of the public, a reporter, or anyone. There, for the first time, members of the jury, you have an insight of what was happening in the investigation. It was starting from the far end of the track down at the A130, and it was Mr. Knights who drew attention to the fact that the temperature was up because the snow was melting and things were changing. Sergeant Christopher Atkins had come down the track and Mr. Knights had seen Mr. Jiggins and Mr. Fearbold. When he looked at the Range Rover, he saw no obvious snow on the roof and he saw the bodies. There was about an inch of snow on the track, and there was no snow in front of the vehicle, and the windows were not iced up. He went back to the track and he put tape across the track, which can be seen in the photos. He said in cross-examination it was the middle of a cold spell and all vehicles out for a length of time would have had ice or snow on them. He had Doc Martin type boots on, but not Doc Martens with a block pattern. He said once we were aware of what we'd got, meaning the site he'd found in the Range Rover, we were very careful where we put our feet. There was quite a bit of snow covering at the time, about an inch. Footmarks can be a very valuable assistance. He walked halfway down the near side of the car and did not remember any cartridge cases on the near side. He would have recorded it if he had. He was taking great care bearing in mind what he was looking at. He said there was 1,001 things going through his mind when he was looking inside the vehicle. You remember Dr. Passard, who was the police surgeon. He first attended the scene at 9:30 and he could not see much then because he'd kept back from the vehicle. He said it was a cold day and there was snow to about the thickness of a centimetre when he first arrived and frost on the ground, overcast weather. He went nowhere near the scene on his first visit, but he did so when he returned at 11:30 when he was escorted to the driver's side of the vehicle. He saw empty cartridges on the ground on the offside, which were the side from which when he first approached the vehicle. He was asked not to contaminate the scene by touching anything. He saw the bodies of the 3 men. He described the injuries he saw, which were afterwards more clearly described by the pathologist, and so I will save the description for then. He saw that the glass from the near side window was shattered. He thought that the gunshot wounds appeared to have caused massive disruptions to the skulls of the 3 victims, and he certified them as dead. In cross-examination, he said he walked behind Superintendent Dibley to the scene. Mr. Dibley guided him. He actually saw 4 cartridge cases. He thought they were on the offside of the vehicle, but he did not count them, and he could not remember how many there were really. It was clear in his mind that he saw 1 cartridge case away from the vehicle. Then it was asked about the time of death. He said there are various methods to ascertain the time of death which will be needed to be by an expert. It is fraught with difficulty. He could not take the body temperatures or take any active steps towards the farm gate. There were 5 12-bore cartridges on the ground by the vehicle, 1 near the front offside wheel, 2 some 3 feet from the vehicle's midpoint on the offside, and 2 in the region of the near side rear corner. The 3 deceased were in the positions that he described. The rear near side window of the door had the rear position fallen out. The vehicle was taken to the police garage for further examination. Removal of the bodies revealed they all 3 suffered head injuries consistent with being caused by a shotgun. Those of the head injuries that he mentioned, the further shotgun wound observed in the right side of Tate's torso. He spoke of the blood splattering on the inside of the vehicle and of close-range shotgun damage from within 2 feet. He put it caused to the front side offside edge of the driver's headrest. It was consistent that damage with the pellets continued on their course and causing injury to the driver's, Rolf's head or face. There were 2 fired shotgun cases in the vehicle, one on the floor near the rear offside door and the other in front of the offside door pocket. There were fragments of plastic cartridge wadding present and several pellets in various areas at the front of the vehicle. He spoke of the gunshot wounds to each of the passengers, saying that those to Tucker were at close range from 18 inches to 2'6". The cartridge cases all came from 7 12-ball Vantage cartridges with a loading of 7.5 size shot-lead shot. Then importantly, he examined the firing marks on all of those cartridges microscopically and was satisfied that all 7 were fired using the same firearm, from which he was almost certain was a pump-action or self-loading 12-ball shotgun. The wads and pieces of wadding were derived from 7 plastic wads of the type that is loaded into 12-ball Vantage shotgun cartridges, and thus could have emanated from those 7 cases. The sample of hair from Tate, the backseat passenger, indicated that the shot which caused the injury to his head, the actual injury, had actually passed through glass prior to causing the injury. The only broken glass was, of course, on the near side. He concluded that 8 shots from the 12-ball shotgun appeared to have been fired at the scene. 2 into the right-hand side of Tucker, the front passenger. 1 into the back of his head. 2 into the right side of his head and face of Rolf, the driver. And 3 at the rear passenger Tate. 1 into the right torso, 1 across back of the head, and 1 into the left side of his head. He thought that most of the shots appeared to have been fired from close range through the open rear offside door of the vehicle, one of the shots to the head and face of Rolf having first passed through the right-hand corner of the driver's headrest. The shot fired across the head of Tate appeared to pass through the glass on the rear near side door. The shot into his head appeared to have been fired from the near side of the vehicle through the same glass. The angle of the shot into his right torso suggested he was in a position similar to when he was found when the shot was fired. All 7 cartridge cases had been fired using the same weapon, probably a pump or self-loading gun having a large capability magazine. He could not discount the use of the gun with a lesser magazine capability that would have required reloading. The likelihood of a large capability magazine and the appearance of the fired wads suggested the use of the gun with a full-length barrel. It was not possible to state with any certainty of what order the shots were fired in, but then he made an assumption, not particularly scientific you may think, and he said that later. It was a reasonable assumption that 1 shot was fired at each victim in turn before the other shots were fired. He said from the relaxed positions of the deceased 3, it appeared to have happened very rapidly. There was no time for special movement or something to move them from their comfortable positions. He said a shotgun cartridge is fired by the bottom half inch of the cartridge containing the propellant and the base being fitted with a primer in the centre of which was soft metal. If the primer was struck with a very large blow, the chemicals ignite, and these chemicals in the primer ignite the main propellant. It is the firing pin that causes the sharp blow. Different weapons leave different marks. The pump action has a single barrel with a magazine below it. The mechanism of an ordinary shotgun, as opposed to a self-loading or pump, was that you loaded a cartridge from a magazine into the chamber by pulling into the rear and then back to the front. He said in this case of a self-loading or pump-action shotgun, from the energy from the discharge was used to transfer the cartridge into the chamber. One was ejected and one was transferred. As to the ejection of a cartridge, in each case, he said from a pump action, you get quite a variable distance. That is a variable distance on how far the ejected case is thrown. The longest being between 5 and 6 feet, but sometimes the cartridge will just drop out of the gun. In a self-loading gun, there will be a little difference, but there is a tendency for the cartridge to eject somewhat further. As to the damage to Tate's head, he said he thought the offside shot struck Tate's head first before striking the window, but the other near side shot into his head was fired through some of the glass in the window. Then he moved entirely from everything he'd been saying before, and I cannot make this distinction more clear, on to the shotgun found at Meadow Cottage. He said that it was a Mossberg New Haven 618 12-ball pump-action shotgun in working order. Cross-examined by Mr. Parkins, Mr. Burns said this. He agreed that a defence expert, a doctor at Ramshaw, was experienced in the field of firearms and had attended at Mr. Burns' laboratory on the 19th of August 1997, being afforded all facilities there, and there was nothing between the two experts except for 1 or 2 differences. Having heard about anything about those details, they were clearly not important. Mr. Burns said that whoever carried out the killings, it was a responsible assumption that they were well versed in the use of a shotgun. It happened very quickly, probably so quickly that the 2 in front did not have time to appreciate what was going on. The suggestion he made that each deceased received a disabling shot before the other shot was his opinion based on the findings of the scene. There would have been very loud noise and a total of 8 shots. He would expect a rapid succession, and anyone hearing the shots would hear a quick succession of discharges. They could have been heard from a distance certainly greater than a mile. Whether someone would hear any whimpering would depend on how quickly the shots came. There would have been a gap between the shots. He had arrived at the scene at 5 minutes to midday. He went into the field and there were some tyre marks which led through the gate at some time, but all he could say was that there were some tyre marks there. There was a footmark visible, possibly at the open door. Most shots were discharged from the rear offside door. Rolf had a wound at the side of his face. Then he was asked about the possibility of Tate's head being turned to the right, and he said this: Mr. Burns could not exclude that Tate's head was turned to the right as the shot was fired, and he tended to support the view that his head was somewhat to the right. He was asked about the grazes on Tate's head, and he said this: he did not think he could entirely exclude the possibility that the round then went on to hurt Tucker. But having said that, he said although he could not entirely exclude the possibility, the 3 injuries to the head of Tucker did not show any disposition of elements which you would expect if one shot had first gone across Tate's head, nor any deposits of blood and hair which you would expect. He said, it is less likely, but I cannot exclude it. A pump-action shotgun ejects to the right. He conducted an examination with scenes of crime officers who were present both before, during and after the removal of the bodies. Somebody had found a cartridge case in the floor well. He considered how it was found there. He excluded the shot from the near side as getting there because it was very unlikely. If it ejected normally, he could not explain the 2 cartridges found in the car. Hughes cannot agree entirely with the deposit of cartridges. He would normally only expect 1 cartridge case at the near side. The angle of discharging to the right varies, and it just failed to go out through the open rear door and fell into the front door pocket. It said if the gun is significantly far into the car, the cartridge case would end up in the vehicle. Turning to a different topic, he said the 7.5 size is popular in clay pigeon shooting. He examined a number of other weapons that had been brought in, several shotguns, none of which fired those cartridges. He examined a revolver and ammunition found at Tate's home address at Gordon Road, Basildon. The revolver was in working order and well capable of firing ammunition. There was also a machine gun from an address at Mill Green, Basildon. You'll remember that is the one in connection with Donna Jaggers that we shall hear about later, and other weapons which he mentioned having examined. None of those other guns had fired the cartridges he examined. He was at the post-mortem, which was full and comprehensive. He was asked about the time of death. Again, he could not come to any evidence of it. He said his own explanation would not indicate the time of death conclusively. He would expect it to be the invariable practice for doctors to attempt to estimate the time of death. He said the car door would be open when the majority of the shots were fired and the door would have been an obstruction to the right. But the shot that grazed Tate's head to have gone into to hit Tucker, Tate's head would have had to be in between the open door and Tucker. If a shot strikes a glancing blow, the pellets would have been disrupted. At close range, the body of the shot goes into the same direction. If there is a glancing impact, the pellet ceased to remain as a closed mass and become disturbed, and there is no sign in the wound of Tucker of that. There was nothing to indicate any material from Tate's head in relation to what was found in Tucker's head. So, that was his evidence in relation to the ballistics of wounds and the shots fired in and about, that is, the Range Rover. Detective Inspector David Hughes took charge at about 10 o'clock at the scenes manager with the duty of overseeing, preserving and examining the scene and calling in the experts. Sergeant Holloway took the first photographs before Mr. King arrived and took over that task. Mr. Hughes supervised the removal of the Range Rover from the scene and he directed it at South Woodham Ferries Police Station examination of the vehicle. The Range Rover was transported to be examined elsewhere because it was too narrow on the track to remove the bodies. As to the car, he said the Range Rover was automatic and was set in drive with the handbrake off. The tank was a third full when it was checked. The vehicle was taken in the afternoon off to the police station and examined then. In cross-examination, Mr. Perkins described about an area that they found in the afternoon that was found with disturbance. From experience, something had been there, but what, I don't know. It was an area 6 foot by 4 foot, something like that. As you can see, some disturbance from the area on the track. In cross-examination, Mr. Parkin said the disturbance was not found until after the pathologist and the firearms and the forensic people were left about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He had 2 suggestions that the area had been disturbed after the snow or someone had stood after the snow had melted. He had to consider that 24 hours before, from the point of view on whether there was light snow and it was frozen overnight. They looked for feet and tyre marks. At the top of the lane at the A130, there was examination for motor oil. He could not say why there was no photo taken of the cartridge case of the front near side door. There was no reason. He could not think of any reason why there was no photograph taken of the cartridge case in the rear footwell. He said that articles should be photographed either in situ or as separate items. There was no scenes of crime officer involved until the pathologist and Mr. Burns and the doctor had arrived. Some of the photographs were taken after the pathologist and Mr. Burns were finished at around about 2 to 3 in the afternoon. He said they recovered all the shotgun cases that were there at the scene at the time and also asked for the removal of the vehicle. He said the actual scene was searched by a fingerprint search team. Only 7 cartridge cases were recovered from the scene. After the scenes of crime officers, there was a specialised search team which made a fingerprint search. He said 1 case could have been taken out and dropped in the snow, but he very much doubts that it did happen. The ignition of the Range Rover was off. He said this after a thorough investigation of the whole scene and submitting the matter to the experts. There was no scientific evidence to connect anybody to the scene. That is a position as you know it, members of the jury, and it has not changed. There is a footprint in one of the photos which will appear that the footprint is slightly under the sill facing towards the front of the vehicle, therefore the door could be open. Then you had Detective Constable Beatus, who was working under Sergeant Hammersley and took part in the detailed examination of the scene for the evidence. The first precaution was once that the area had been photographed to make a path very close to the hedge on the left-hand side to avoid damage of footprints. He then produced Tate and Tucker's mobile phones and their address books. He took samples and submitted the 7 shotgun cases to the Forensic Science Laboratory at Huntington for ballistic examination. Cross-examined, Mr. Parkin said all 3 deceased were dressed in boots, jeans or a leather jacket. A head bag was also found and examined. The 3 men had £1,430 altogether in their possession. A reporter did wander onto the scene. He came from a different direction from the A130. There were press people around all the time. It was difficult to keep them away. The reporter of whom he spoke had Wellington boots on, taken in case he had trodden on anything. But the patterns on the boots were clearly not the impressions that were found. They did not see any Wellington boots other than those they wore themselves. There were not Wellington boot marks on the offside. This was an unhappy investigation because they had problems with the snow melting. Of all the witnesses at the scene, the last of importance was Dr. Paula Lannis, the pathologist. She attended at 12:15 on the 6th of December and saw the 3 victims dead in the Range Rover. She described the wounds. The driver had a shotgun wound just below the right ear with an exit wound through the left eye. Damage was there to the right side of the headrest, just above his seat. The front passenger was nearly upright and had shotgun wounds both over the right side of his face, and blood was splattered inside the vehicle and the windscreen, mainly on the passenger side. The rear passenger was leaning to his left and his head resting on the lower edge of the near side rear passenger window, which was shattered. Fragments of bone and brain protruded for a shotgun wound over the back of his head and a missile graze. A superficial wound ran over the back of his head. 3 blue shotgun shells lay near a tyre track in the snow alongside the driver's door, and 2 blue shells lay in the snow by the rear near side of the car. Deep mudded field tyre tracks passed out the gate about 20 metres beyond it, and small puddles of slightly muddled water with red staining filled the tyre tracks, bleeding from the car up to the gate and beyond it. At 7:15, the bodies were removed from the car at South Woodham Ferris police station. Then she spoke about what she found standing there when they were removed at the police station. She said the front passenger, that would be Tucker, grasped the mobile telephone between his legs. His head rested on his right shoulder. Wounds were identified over the right temple and over the right angle of the jaw. Moving to the rear passenger, Tate, she said the rear passenger grasped a mobile telephone in his right hand with the strap wrapped round his middle finger. Shotgun wounds were present over the back of his head and on the right side of his chest. Missile graze over the top of his head. Fragments of glass were present around his left ear. The driver, Rolf, had a large shotgun wound over the right angle of his jaw with a burn over the right side of his neck. The second shotgun wound was behind the right ear with an exit wound over the left side of his face. Further shotgun shells were recovered from the back of the car in an aluminium strip at the bottom of the offside rear door and in the pocket of the driver's door. Dr. Lannis conducted a post-mortem on the body of Patrick Tate at 11:10 that day, and on the body of Tucker at 12:30, and on the body of Craig Rolfe at 1:50. Her conclusions were as follows. As to the specific wounds that the bodies had suffered, she ascribed the cause of death in each case to be shotgun wounds. Through Tate's head wound was consistent with the weapon being discharged close to the skin, and his chest wound consistent with being discharged near the body. Tucker's wounds were consistent with the weapon being discharged close to the head, as were Rolfe's wounds. In no case was there any evidence that the victim had attempted to defend himself. So evidence of a discharge close to the heads of all 3 deceased. She was cross-examined, and to Mr. Parkins she said that the purpose of her being called to the scene was for many reasons. She conceded the main reason was to assist with the timing of death. It was also to see the bodies in situ. The vehicles were taken away on a low loader with the bodies inside, and there was a chance the bodies' positions might alter. Asked again about the time of death, she said the time of death was not easy to achieve with great accuracy. The time of death can be important. If it were a feature of my examination, I would examine the body temperature and the ambient temperature. That is the temperature all round of the surrounding conditions. I'd examine the degree and extent of the rigor mortis. It can take 12 hours to come, and it lasts 12 hours. She was asked about the deep mud-filled tyre tracks, and she said they were the same for about 20 yards. It was almost as if the vehicle had gone in past the gate and reversed out, which you will understand, of course, that she was really there for her medical opinion rather than her observation of the scene. So far as Tate is concerned, she said she cannot give the order of wounds, especially if they were very close in time. There was a shotgun wound to the head, and the head may swing. The first wound originated from the left, so did the second, but the wound to the chest came from the right. Tucker's injuries were under his neck. I thought he had 2 shots from the near side. I did identify the damage to Tate's hands, and if there had been an injury from breaking a window, I would have noticed it. There was no flesh injury to his hands. Then Mr. Lederman came to cross-examine. She said again that Mr. Tucker had 3 separate entry wounds to his head and 3 separate shots entered and more or less stayed in his head. Tate was shot 3 times, and in respect to the superficial graze, there was a few pellets but no wadding. Rolfe was shot from the offside of his head, moving to the near side. If Tate was shot from the offside, he could have been thrown to the near side of the car. I cannot exclude he may have moved to the near side. He slumped over. One would assume after being shot he had fallen across the seat. Tucker's head had rolled to the offside. Then she was asked the same question about the possibility of Tucker's wound coming from after the shot had passed across Tate's head. She said it may have been that the shot Tucker received came from the near side of the car and went through Tate. She was asked The question, could the superficial wound to the Tate have ended up in Tucker and caused his head to move to the offside? Her answer, such as it was, you may think not very helpful. She said, I find it difficult to answer such a question. It means getting trajectories of these wounds. She said there was a superficial wound to take with no wadding. She said she would need to look at it more closely. She did not have that information that day. She said trajectory calculations could have been done with great difficulty. Once bodies are inspected to learn the precise location of wounds, positions are altered, and that would interfere with trajectory calculations. She said, I provide the locations of these injuries and the cause of death, and anything after that is done by someone else. It is a team investigation and we will consult each other. It is a ballistic expert who can more properly deal with that. Then coming back to the time of death, she said, to work out the time of death is a complicated formula and involves the difference between the body temperature when found and normal temperature. Clothing is also a factor. A calculation has been developed, but it was not relevant to my purpose at the scene. I was not called to make an assessment of the time of death. If you take a temperature at any other time than at South Woodham Ferris Police Station, integrity would have been lost, meaning integrity at the scene. The accuracy of such a calculation would have been diminished. I did not disturb the integrity of the vehicle at the scene of the crime. The bodies remained in the vehicle for the purposes of transportation. At the police station, the bodies were positioned as I'd seen them at the scene. Rigor mortis had started before the time I saw the bodies for the first time at the scene. Rigor mortis starts at a certain time. It may start within 2 to 4 hours of death. Then she said, the circumstances of my examination did not permit examination at the time of death. It depends how valuable and how relevant it is whether it can be done. I did not certainly ascertain the time of death in this type of situation particularly. That means that is not her practice. She was asked about hypophysis, which is the deep pink coloration seen in the lower parts of the body where the blood is drained to. She said it was a very limited assistance. These parameters do not hold up. There is no accuracy in calculating for these factors. In many cases, such things are taken, and in many cases, they are not. Calculations depend on such things as heating, clothing, drafts, and whether windows are open. In re-examination, she said the proximity of the weapon to the wound is judged by the burning, the cloud and the blackening, and the size of the wound. It does not exceed more than the 3 inches. There are factors which would indicate that the skin was very close to the muzzle at the time of discharge. She said in Tucker's case, too, it indicates that the muzzle was close to his head at the time of discharge. To get that from the flame burning and the size of the wound, I would put it at a 9-inch range. There was a flame burning on the collar of his anorak. The second wound of Tucker indicated that the weapon was fired close to the skin. The third wound, equally, she drew a conclusion that the muzzle was held close to the wound. Discharge is damage from the lower end of his injury. There you are, members of the jury. From her evidence, you will get her conclusions as to the proximity of the gun to the wounds themselves, but you will get no assistance after the time of death. You will remember that Detective Superintendent Barrington thought there should always be ascertainment of the time of death. You will remember that Detective Superintendent Barrington thought there should always be ascertainment of the time of death, and he would have expected that to be done by the pathologist who was called. Dr. Lannis's view was that she was not asked to do it, and does not do it in any event. That really is all the evidence I need to remind you about in relation to the findings of the scene. You can take from it, of course, there is no evidence to connect any person to the scene. That was the evidence of Detective Inspector Hughes in the sense of any forensic findings, and that there is no evidence either to establish the time of death. I move there forward from the scene of the crime to other evidence in the case. I move in fact onto the evidence of Darren Nichols.